and War by Lieutenant General Vinayak Gopal Patankar. I would first like to thank Shubham Sonar for recommending Mr. Patankar sir. Talking about PSA, the Political Science Association of Wilson College is a student-led body which aims to sensitize people on various socio-political issues. Thus, this session is a part of our Independence Month celebration. Let me give a brief introduction of today's speaker, Lieutenant General Vinayak Gopal Patankar, retired. Patankar sir has served in Indian Army for around 4 decades. Sir has participated in 1965, 1972, and 1999 Kargil War. For this, he was awarded Uttam Yudh Seva Medal. He has also played a pivotal role for bringing normalcy in the Kashmir Valley. For this, he was conferred Param Vishist Seva Medal, the highest peacetime award for military service. He was also member of a track 2 dialogue with Pakistan for about 3 years. Currently, Patankar sir works with volunteer groups and institutions like ASEEM and Sarhad. Both organizations work in border states and strive on areas to bring emotional integration of the people living there with the rest of the thing. Let me mention some rules which we will be following throughout the session. The lecture will be followed by a question and answer round. I would also like to request every participant, please unmute only when identified. I hope we all maintain a certain decorum throughout the session. So without the further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Patankar sir to take over the floor. Sir, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and very kind of you for that introduction. I'm actually very thankful, despite the little dig I had at Shubham a while ago. Thanks to Shubham that I was able to interact with you today. It was his idea. So thank you, Shubham. I'm also grateful to Sakshi Zadav for taking the trouble to coordinate all the details for today's event. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm addressing a very enlightened and erudite audience, if I might say that, and to a faculty or to an association of a very renowned college, whose history goes back to 186 years, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a very formidable audience that I have today, and therefore I'm very conscious of the fact that that this is a very important opportunity that has come my way. The topic that is given to me is certainly of very contemporary interest. There's no doubt about that, and it's also very challenging because, like I was mentioning informally just a few minutes back, that it delves basically that the whole theme of today's address is based on theory, and then the challenge is to relate it to today's situation and what does it actually mean. Theories are okay as far as books are concerned, but in practical terms, unless we are able to translate those theories into finding solutions for current problems, they would only remain in the books, in the pages of the books. So that's how it is. And funnily enough, although, like I said, it delves into the basic theory of nationalism and the basic theory of war, these are two topics on which people talk glibly. Even ordinary, conversations sometimes turn to, heavy subjects like nationalism or indeed war, and people talk about it in a very, offhandish manner without really realizing the depth of that particular subject and being an expert in that field. Reminds me of a small little joke where, a man had a very bad cold. So he went to the doctor and said, Doctor, I have this very nasty cold and a bit of cough also. So can you fix it? So the doctor said, Yeah, sure. Do you have a window facing the west? He said, yes, I have a window that faces the west. So he said, you get breeze from there? I said, yes, I do. So he said, all right. What you do is, you, after having a shower, you open that window and stand in front of it with no clothes on or minimum clothes on. So he said, doctor, are you crazy? I'll get pneumonia if I expose myself like that. He said, yeah, sure, you'll get pneumonia. But pneumonia is something I can treat. Common cold is something I cannot treat. So the point is that people treat everything like common cold and pop two aspirins or whatever is their favorite and think they are dealing with it adequately, which is not the case because, as we have now found out to our grief over the last little more than a year and a half, that common cold may not be as common as we think it is. It could be the beginning of something far more nasty. So this is how serious the subject is, and how casually sometimes people tend to talk about it. You all may wonder that I'm talking about um, nationalism and war in the same breath, and combining that as an extension or something that is embedded in political science. Um, but then it's for a reason. You know, about 2 centuries back, in fact, more than that, I would say, um, somebody like Clausewitz, General Clausewitz was a Prussian general in the Prussian army, and he is considered as the authority on the theory of war. And this is how he defined war. He said, war is nothing else but continuation of politics by other means. Now, some people might think that this is too casual a way to look at war, but when you actually delve into it, you realize that nobody could have summarized uh, that better than Clausewitz. So that's the relationship between the two, and therefore this is sort of a symbiotic relationship, and we'll take this further as we go along. May I have the first slide, please? Uh, yeah, right. Thank you. Um, so let's first begin at the beginning, as they say. What is nationalism? You have, I'm sure you all know the way it is defined in your own field in political science. But basically, next slide, please. It is defined as loyalty and devotion to a nation, especially a sense of national consciousness, that is, being part or an embodiment of a nation. Here, my mind goes back to the nation state, the Treaty of Westphalia, and the whole history, how a nation state was came to be recognized. So this is basically how it is defined. That it's a sense of or a national consciousness, and it's an undefined sense of loyalty and devotion. You can't really measure loyalty or devotion. So it's a sense that is felt universally among the hearts of all people who are part of that nation. And what is it aimed at? Exalting one nation above the others, right? Saying that my nation is the greatest nation on earth. That is the kind of feeling that that props up nationalism, and we will see what impact it has, or what kind of ramifications it has in terms of when you look at it as an entity. All right, so exalting one nation above the others, and the primary emphasis: why is my nation greater or the greatest nation on earth? Because the kind of culture that represents my nation, the kind of national interests that my nation pursues. So this is the edifice. This is how people think of nationalism, and this is the reason why they feel that their nation is the greatest. Let me touch upon these two which I mentioned. The two issues which make people feel that they are superior to other nations: culture and then national interest. Now, culture is actually a part of a nation's soft power, and um, the soft power is something. Just give me a minute, please. I'm going to close this door. I'm sorry for the little pause, but I was talking about culture being part of soft power. What is soft power? Soft power is something that a nation or a people exercise over people of other nations, or why only other nations, other communities. A community exercises that soft power over another community, and similar between nations. It is something that is perceived. It is not something that is seen. And it is something that people easily accept as something good, something to look up to. Whereas national interest could be pursued by a nation by using all means at its disposal, including hard power. What's hard power? Hard power can be typically military power, economic power, industrial power. These days, it could be cyber capability, it could be anything, which a nation will not hesitate to use in the pursuance of its national interest. So you can see that hard and soft power are so diverse in terms of how they are applied or how they are exploited. Um, while we are looking at nationalism, in fact, one more thing let me say about soft and hard power. So, as I said, soft power is through convincing, whereas hard power is through coercion. That's the difference. One, you see India's soft power, where it has reached and what it has achieved. If you consider any country southeast of our country, you will find evidence of India's soft power everywhere. I don't know how many of you have visited some of these countries, Indonesia in particular, and you see there are statues of Arjun, there are statues of some of our deities. In fact, if you go to Bali, a very popular tourist spot in Indonesia, you'll be amazed at the number of Ganesh murtis that are displayed all over, and Ganesh murtis that are available for sale, whether they are wood carved or stone crafted or whatever. It's amazing. You take the architecture in the temples all across, right up to Laos and Cambodia, and you find that their temple architecture is very heavily influenced by Indian architecture. So soft power has reached there, and mind you, we have people of our country or the kings and kingdoms of this nation never ruled over those areas, but they they were seafarers. They went, visited this, they took the culture along, and the locals embraced it with open arms. Now, I don't have to give any examples of coercion that you see all the time. How a strong nation uses coercion or coercive methods to push forward its own agenda on countries that are weaker or are their target countries, so to say. Okay, now From nationalism, let's go to a little step further. You must have heard of supranationalism. What is supranationalism? It is like super nationalism, right? Something better than nationalism, something greater than nationalism. What does it mean? Again, I'm going to the definition, but we'll see what that means actually. It talks about supranationalism, meaning advocacy of the formation of supranational organizations or even governments. Okay, what does that mean in real life, in real terms? What does it really mean? Let's see. The let's talk about an example, and then that will become clear. All of us have heard of or know about the European community, right? The European Union. The European community transcended borders, right? And set up what is known as the European Union. The European Union was something that countries or people, citizens of different countries, were happy to be a part of, right? So you find that formation of an organization like the European Union, and mind you, the European Union also has a government. It has the European Parliament based in Brussels, in Belgium. So this is something people happily did. Did they have to surrender their sovereignty for it? No, not at all. And see how that has come about happily and how it has existed all these years, and it is in no danger of being dismantled in a hurry. They have their own flag, they have their own currency, but they have stopped short of raising an armed forces, right? There are no European armed forces. There is the German army, the French navy, the Spanish air force. So each one has their own armed forces, for instance. So what has happened? Very wisely, supranationalism was not allowed to run wild. People who had that supranationalism ethos or the concept in their minds stopped short of actually spreading the jurisdiction across the board. So there are areas where European Union does not tread. It remains outside. Armed forces is one area which I told you about. Similarly, countries speak their own languages. European Union hasn't said that the language all over Europe will be French or German or or English. Each country speaks its own language. They guard their own heritage, their own cultures, their unique communities. And so therefore this is a happy example of supranationalism. Now you take the opposite. We will talk about the opposite maybe in another context, but I'll talk about that in just a minute. In fact, we're going to that in the next slide, please. I talked about a happy example of the European Union. But when I talked about a nationalism that transcends the borders, a nationalism which is supranationalism, which actually is sort of aggressive in nature, in a manner of speaking, raises two questions. Can a religious ideology or ethnicity as a nation generate a sense of supranationalism? Again, this is pure theory. So let's talk about a practical example. And that practical example brings to mind some examples. Let me go to the next slide. You know, intense nationalism, which result into supranationalism, and therefore supranational groups that promote that kind of nationalism, that could become a cause of war, of course, in the ultimate analysis. But it could certainly cause the beginning of friction, a beginning of a conflict-like situation, which can escalate into a conflict and then lead on to a full-fledged war. Some examples that come to mind. Think of LTTE in Sri Lanka, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. I don't know how many of you would recall that, because it happened quite a few years back, and you must have been in school or maybe in primary school. I don't know how long back it was. But what I'm saying is that compared to where you are now, what did the LTTE want? They stood for a Tamil Eelam, a Tamil nation, and where certainly within Sri Lanka, which meant that a part of Sri Lanka would no longer consider themselves to be part of Sri Lanka, but a different nation called Tamil Eelam. And how did they go about this? How did they garner support for this concept? They invoked the spirit of pan-Tamil identity. The Tamilians are a very proud people, and understandably so. They are a very proud civilization. Their culture and civilization dates back. It's one of the oldest, if not the oldest. So, and it's a very fully developed civilization. So therefore, that pride of being a Tamil or a Tamilian, as the Brits would call it. So being the pride of being Tamil goes across the borders. It doesn't get contained within Tamil Nadu, for instance. Wherever there is a Tamil-speaking person, he feels that he has this identity as a Tamil, right? So where did the LTTE go to spread this? After all, to gain support, both in terms of financial support, moral support, and in a manner of speaking, international support. They got huge support from two countries in particular, Singapore and Malaysia. And of course, wherever there is Tamil diaspora across the world, in the United States, there's a sizable Tamil population. So they got huge support from the Tamil diaspora across the world for their cause. And people supported that cause wholeheartedly. They supported because they felt that it was a just cause, right? What it translated into, what it degenerated into is another matter. But what I'm saying is, this is how supranationalism can rise beyond a nation's borders. Another example, Khalistan. On a smaller scale, but yet there is the Sikh diaspora, the Indian diaspora. Some non-Sikhs also felt that the Sikhs had a cause, and some of them did go to the length of supporting it. So the Sikhs felt that their identity transcends beyond India's borders. And so therefore there was this demand for Khalistan, and a large Sikh population in Canada and the UK and elsewhere had a section of that population who supported the cause. Again, because the aims did not stop at just creating a strong identity that would support their identity as Indians or as American citizens or as Canadian citizens or whatever citizens. Then it went into an unfortunate direction. And of course, as you know, it was cut down to size. The third example that comes to mind is the ISIS. the Islamic State. Now, Islamic State, it's as a concept, it began a few years back, and it was hoped that um, people who are the followers of Islam would rise in unison across the world and support the concept of an Islamic State. Mind you, it did not actually spread the concept in a very peaceful manner. In fact, they chose to do so in a very violent manner. So it was a kind of, if you don't accept it, then we'll impose it. And that's the thing that has been going on in Syria and Iraq and that part of the world. But once again, people support it when they feel that it's a just cause. It is something that will raise my identity as a part of a certain group, as a part of a certain community, as a as a part of those who follow a certain religion. But then when it degenerates or when it sort of slips into something which smacks of personal agenda or people seeking after uh, certain personal advantages, then it takes a turn for the worse. And that's how ISIS today, has actually once again shrunk from what it was. It has shrunk to small penny packets, also in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. And when they get an opening, like now they're looking for an opening in Afghanistan, then they try and make an entry there. But these are some of the examples that come to mind, and that's why right in the beginning I'd mentioned that there's no point in sticking to definitions and theories. Keep them in the book, but we take them out of the books to relate to current situation, and therefore that is where all these examples which I spoke about, they come to mind. Let's go a little further now. From nationalism, we went to supranationalism. Now let's come to patriotism. Now, what is patriotism? Sometimes, in fact, most of the time, I would say, it's very common to find people in their normal conversation use these two terms, nationalism and patriotism, as interchangeable. They say nationalism when they mean patriotism, and vice versa. Do they really mean the same thing? Are they indeed interchangeable? I don't know. If this was a Q&A at this stage, we would have had a little dialogue. But let me go a little further, and perhaps we can take it up later on if you still wish to deal with this a little further in depth. But let me try and bring out the subtle difference between the two. May I have the next slide, please? The difference between nationalism and patriotism, they certainly are similar. Why are they similar? Because they both emphasize the values or those cherished ideals and values, as we talked about earlier: loyalty, devotion, and very strong feelings for one country. When the Indian cricket team lines up for the national anthem, and all of us feel happy, when the tricolors unfurled, or when they're singing the national anthem, or when we had recently the Indian tricolor work when one of our athletes got the gold medal. It fills our chest with happiness. It swells with pride. These are the strong feelings that sometimes translate themselves into a physical expression. Like we say, my chest is filled with pride, or it added 2 kilos to my weight. It's just that way of expressing the kind of loyalty, devotion, the kind of strong feeling you have about being part of a certain country. And in the armed forces, that feeling is extremely strong. And people sometimes they say, you know, why do soldiers do the things that they do? How can they, you know, go ahead when they know death is certain? The Vikram Batras of this country, the Param Chakra Vijetas of this country, why did they do what they did? They didn't do it simply because it was their duty, but because they felt that they had to bring honor to the Tiranga. They have to bring honor. It starts from absolute grassroots level. They have to bring honor to their unit, their battalion, their battalion's honor, their battalion's flag, their comrades, and then it goes all the way up to the Tiranga, to the tricolor. And that is why you find, I don't know how many of you have seen the latest movie called Sher Shah about the Kargil War. So the crowning glory for that achievement comes when they plant the tricolor on top of Tiger Hill or Tololing or one of those great heights in Kargil. So these are physical expressions of that strong feeling. But like I said, let's come back to the subtle difference between nationalism and patriotism. They're not synonyms. You see, once again, nationalism always insists on placing one nation above the other nation or above all nations. Patriotism is not like that. Patriotism says, I'm willing to die for my country. It doesn't say that my country is the greatest on earth and therefore, you know, I'm prepared to do this, that, and the other. So there's certain difference between that is patriotism tends to remain within your own confines of your own borders, your own territory, your own sovereignty. Nationalism is a little closer to jingoism. You know, it goes a little beyond and say, Sare jahan se acha Hindustan. You know, now that's not nationalism per se, but I'm just saying that perhaps that is one way to understand that we are better than every other country on the face of this earth. That is the subtle difference between the two, right? Okay, let's go a little further. Actually, I'm tempted to, let's go back to the previous slide. I'm tempted to touch upon something which is right now happening within our own country, both this nationalism and patriotism business. You find that there is a certain surge. We can discuss this a little more during question and answers, but let me touch upon it right now, since we have been talking about the subtle difference between the two terms. There is a certain surge in the country to revive and to give a place of honor to our own history and heritage, which it is felt did not get its own due all these years, particularly when we were under the British Raj, because it was suppressed and the British actually imposed their heritage, their history, their way of reading Indian history, or whatever is from their point of view important enough in Indian history. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. Nobody can deny that. How many of us really know the achievements of Vijayanagar? How many? How many know about the Cholas, about the Satvahans? People may not even have heard of them. Yet, that is our ancient history. We accept that we are one of the most ancient countries on the face of this planet. We have history going back, and mind you, let me tell you my own personal experience in this. I did a long training course in the United States for a year. And throughout that 1 year that I lived in the United States, there were excursions. They would go and say, "Oh, today we are going to visit this battlefield, which is famous during the Civil War or the War of Independence against the British, the Civil War against North versus the South, and all that. And so we are going to Gettysburg battlefield." And then they would be quick. They would be quick to add, "Listen, I don't think you'll be interested. After all, our history is what, 270 years old? That was that time. Now it's a little more because I did that training about 25 years back. But they would tell us, oh, your history goes back 5,000 years. How would you be interested in something that is just 250 years old? See, now that is the kind of heritage that I'm talking about. So there is no denying the fact that upsurge of this kind of a feeling of giving importance to your own history and your own heritage is justified. And it is now being promoted by the current government. But obviously, when you do that, you're trampling over some established norms of history and heritage. Like people sometimes say, this is the greatest, this is the highest mountain, and this is, again in America, they were telling me that, Mount McKinley in Alaska is their highest mountain. Then I told them that, actually, some of the posts that the Indian Army mans are at that altitude in Siachen Glacier. They said, you must be joking. I said, no. I showed them pictures. I said, our highest post is at 22,000 feet plus. We don't have helicopters that can reach that height. That is where we struggle. And we do innovation to try and, make that helicopter somehow climb beyond its what it is designed for. So what I'm saying is that we are certainly justified, but obviously it will, while doing that, those people whose moorings are firmly embedded into that kind of history which they've learned in school, in colleges, or when they did training abroad, they find that suddenly their moorings are shaking. And they are the ones who oppose this and say, well, this government is, acting a little macho. They're just thumping their chest and doing this, that, and the other. But the truth lies somewhere in between the two. So this is the contemporary issues. I don't want to go into any murky politics. So we'll stop it there and get to the next part, and that is war. Next slide, please. I am once again going to go back to Clausewitz, General Clausewitz, who said war is a continuation of politics by other means. By other means meaning any other means, right? And military incursions or a military war is part of the same, which means why do we go to war? And why do we make war as a military? Because there is a political aim to be achieved. There is no military aim. The military culls out its aims to capture this or to advance there based on what the political aim is. And so the political leadership sets the aim and the military goes to war to achieve that aim. In political science, I know I'm treading on your territory, but it talks about it being a political instrument. Among the many instruments that the government has at its disposal, war is a political instrument. In fact, even a threat of going to war can work as an instrument. So it may not come to actually going to war per se, but preparations. What happened after the attack on our parliament in 2013 December 2001? The Indian government decided full mobilization of its armed forces. That put a scare in Pakistan. I saw it happening. I was in Kashmir that time. And I realized that it actually set the cat amongst the pigeons, as they say. The Pakistanis never expected that because of this terrorist attack on the parliament, the Indian government will mobilize with a view to going to war. So, and the government didn't mince any words. They made it very clear that we are now preparing ourselves for the worst. That actually scared Pakistan. Till they got hold of the Americans and the international pressure to say, please tell the Indians to back off. So, what I'm saying is that it is certainly a political instrument. The dictionary, however, I don't find that definition very satisfactory because it only talks about an armed conflict. Because war may not be an armed conflict at all. When we come to today's warfare, you'll realize that we might actually have a war won or lost without firing a single shot. Some of you might be surprised by what I'm saying, but that's the reality. It's war still. It fits into the definition of war where the entire nation's resources can be mobilized to achieve a political aim. It may be a threat of use of military force. It may be a threat of coercion through, you know, economic arm twisting, like we talked about right in the beginning, or anything. War, the dictionary defines also as a period. You know, a whole period is referred to as war, like the First World War, the Second World War, the Kargil War, the 1971 Bangladesh War, which talks about a period, not about a specific uh, battle or a specific purpose for which an action is taken. It also talks about the state of war, that is, whether the whole art and science of war, as it were. So, anyway, um, having defined war, let's go a little step further now. And that's I'm now coming to more or less the end of my presentation. But I said there is a link between nationalism and war when I started off. Let's now examine that link. Does nationalism lead to war? Can it be a cause for war? Next slide, please. Can it be a cause? Now there are theories and there are theories. Some theories support the proposition that nationalism is indeed what causes war. Because when nationalism goes out of control, a country is encouraged to go to war. There are those equally of the opposite view that nationalism is unnecessarily being blamed for being a cause of war. That's not so. War is caused by a multiple set of factors, and therefore don't just blame nationalism as a cause of war. Once again, it's a bit of both. It's a bit of both, but certainly nationalism per se, we can say with certain conviction that that's not the sole cause of war, nor is it the only cause of war, in the sense that if you let nationalism go beyond a certain point, it will result into war. However, like I said, both are right. There are some examples where nationalism has led to war, and there are others where nationalism has not led to war. One example I already gave you, and that is of Europe. European Union is a classic example of nationalism which has transcended borders, right? So therefore, that's a very good example of how nationalism cannot become a cause for war. I spoke about ISIS. Again, we saw that it has definitely led to war because of the manner in which that nationalism was allowed to spread. It was not spread out of convincing people or by their own free will, but they say it's either my way or the highway. Either you accept that uh, we're going to have an Islamic state, and that is the greatest need for this earth of ours, and we will not stop till the entire earth is under an Islamic state or Islamic law. So obviously that did not gel very well with many other communities, many other countries who had their own national interests and own national pride and pride for their own religion. So it resulted into war, a full-fledged war, of course, between unequals, but it was still violent. It led to a full-fledged war. Of course, the complete resources of a country didn't come to face another country's complete resources. But war, nevertheless, it was. When we later on talk on the changing nature of war, we will come to that. So, if I mention Israel, and we'll debate this during the question and answers if you like, is Israel a case of nationalism? And that is why the Arabs had gone to war with Israel, and Israel has had so many wars in its short history. Yes and no again. The Jews never wanted a nation of their own. There was no concept of a Jewish nation because the Jews were quite happy in living in various countries doing their own thing. They were scholars, they were business people, they were smart people, and they were quite happily living in countries where they were till such time when persecution and oppression drove them to the wall. Then, of course, there was the Holocaust in Germany when lakhs and lakhs of Jews were eliminated brutally. That led to a certain rise of Jewish nationalism. So you see, there was a trigger, and the trigger was oppression, the trigger was persecution of Jews. So it depends again as to what the motivation is behind a certain theory to prompt that to escalate all the way to lead to a war. The Arabs, of course, went to war because they felt that the Jews are encroaching upon what has been their traditionally native lands. And who are these guys who suddenly come here and claim that this is now going to be our land and this is going to be our state, and Jerusalem is our holy city and is the holiest city, just as Mecca is for Muslims, so is Jerusalem for Jews, and so on and so forth. Let's not get involved in that, but let's talk about, I talked about changing nature of war. And that's going to be my last item that I'll talk about, but very briefly, because changing nature of war is a topic by itself, and one can actually devote a considerable amount of time and space for it. But war is today no longer as we deem it to be. Anyone, any ordinary citizen, even most of you, if I were to ask you, how do you see war? You see war only in one way. Soldiers fighting on the border against the Chinese, against the Pakistanis, against this and that. That is war. Then we go back, because you see the images in our mind are war against Pakistan in 47-48 on the J&K border, 1965 against Pakistan on the western border, against the Chinese in 1962, then in 1971 the liberation of Bangladesh. All these, and of course latest being in the series being the Kargil war. So we have those images of war. But like I also said, that the shape of war is changing. And now we are getting into other terminologies which you may have heard. I'm going to only mention those terminologies and talk about them just for a minute or so and not go into the depth of that because uh, we just don't have that kind of time. But today there are regular wars we understand, which are the conventional wars. But there are irregular wars, which is the war against terrorism, the war against um, a particular ideology, the war against well, why go into war is a term that is now being used as war against poverty. That's not what we are talking about here, because when we are talking about nationalism and war, we are talking more of the violent kind. But today we are going into the realm of a cyber war, an information war. Mind you, if the enemy can completely dislocate your systems that are in the cyber domain, you know, our power supplies, our railways, so many of our systems are controlled by by cyber systems that if the enemy can completely dismantle your cyber system or incapacitate your cyber system, you will not be in a position to wage war. Where is the question of even firing a single shot? If all our country, the entire country is without power, let's say, if it's possible to dislocate, and you get glimpses of this sometimes or the other. Power outages in major metros like Mumbai. It happened in the US. What to talk of India? The US got a taste of what it would be like to be at the receiving end of a cyber war. So, what is it culminating into or going in the realm of what is now known as a hybrid war? A hybrid war is a combination of economic war, cyber war, information war, conventional war, and many other subsects of it. So now we are going into a realm where war, as we imagine, may not only be fought on the borders. In fact, it may not be fought on the borders at all, like I said. War today, my dear young ladies and young gentlemen, has reached your doorstep already. You just have to open your doors and be conscious of the fact that it has. Through terrorism, through hacking, through many ways, the enemy is reaching out to you. If somebody's bank account is hacked, we just look at that as a criminal activity. But extrapolate that into other fields, and you will realize that if somebody sitting in a far off place can actually hack into your account and empty your account of the every last paisa, can he do the same with the sources of your power? Not only the power of electricity and that kind of power, but all kinds of power. These are all elements of a comprehensive national power, which means the capability of a country which depends on so many different sub capabilities, which together make a nation strong. If that is threatened through what I'm calling as a hybrid war, then we are looking at each one of us as a potential soldier, as a potential warrior, as a potential fighter. You may not fight with an AK-47 in your hand, but you may have to fight with a computer keyboard in your hand, or maybe other electronic gadgetry in your hand. That could be it. Look at the way the drones have proliferated. We don't even have a foolproof method of detecting drones, leave alone destroying them, because they are so tiny They're so tiny that they don't have a radar cross section. A radar came into being in the Second World War because the people just didn't know where the enemy aircraft is. And therefore, scientists went to work and they found a system which could detect an oncoming aircraft. Then they went below the sea level, and the corresponding thing of a radar below the sea level is called sonar. Sonar is something that does the same job as a radar, but with sound waves, with waves that go through the medium of water. So that was then they found an answer, because at that time all the allied shipping that was, all the help for the war, Second World War, that was coming from the US, the major continental US, across the Atlantic to Europe, was being intercepted by German submarines called U-boats, and they just couldn't figure out where they are because there was no device to detect them. So sonar came into being. Today we need a similar gadget to detect drones, and maybe something else tomorrow. The drones have reduced in size so much because of miniaturization that today they are talking about drones that can be held on the palm of your hand. And 1,000 such drones can be launched at a moment's notice from the belly of an aircraft or on top of a building or a tower. These are very scary thoughts, and I'm not trying to scare you, but I'm just painting a picture of where warfare is going. So this is the trend in which war is going today. I think I've been speaking for almost close to an hour, because I think I started at about 5 minutes or 7 minutes past 5 o'clock, and I have to leave some time for question and answers, which I'm sure is going to be very interesting. But one last thing remains on my agenda, and that is the futility of war. I was asked to touch upon, is war necessary? Or is war something that will actually fetch us results? After all that I've said, I don't know whether we can give a definitive answer that war is a thought that that is diminished. There's no reason to go to war. I'll grant one part. Probably there'll not be the kind of wars that we fought, where an entire set of nations fought another set of nations. Classic example being the Second World War, the First World War, or Iran-Iraq war that went on for 8 years, or war between Vietnam and America, an equal war. And is a crazy war. On one side, you had the latest technology and the world's greatest power, and on the other, you had the ordinary peasant in a black pajama fighting them. And guess who won in the end? That farmer in a black pajama won. So war itself, it is manifesting itself in different forms. And whether it is necessary or not, as long as there are national interests and as long as there is nationalism, wars will continue. Whether it is a futile thing, only the end result will prove. There are examples of political aims being achieved through war. But equally, there are examples of the futility. Today, we don't need any debate on this after seeing what is happening in Afghanistan. After 20 long years and $3 trillion, the Americans have withdrawn from that place and left Afghanistan in no better shape than what they found initially. That could be argued. It could be argued for the simple reason that there is a ray of hope. The younger generation, which grew in the last 20 years, and today again, Afghanistan has the advantage of demography, with the younger generation being the largest percentage of that population, they have tasted freedom. They have tasted technology. They don't want to go to Middle Ages. So they have left it in a slightly different frame of mind, but look at what cost. Look at the way people are dying in the streets of Kabul and elsewhere. So war could be futile if that's the way it ends up in. But there are, like I said, examples of how wars have achieved national aims and national objectives of certain countries in a limited sense. So it's neither futile nor is it uh, not a necessity. Sometimes it becomes a necessity. I think I'll stop there and leave some time for question and answers. Um, I hope I've been able to do justice to the task that was given to me. Jai Hind.
Thank you so much for giving such an insightful talk on nationalism, supranationalism, patriotism, and war. So, opening up the floor for regular participants. Yeah. So, if you want any questions, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We will take it up. And if you want to ask directly, please put Q in the chat box and unmute only when identified. So, sir, there are some few questions which we have through our registration form. So the first question is from Anirudh Padge, which I think you kind of answered in the last part of your talk. Uh, Nevertheless, I will still ask the question. In this 21st century, one might not see physical wars, but they are being fought, such as cyber attacks, debt trap, soft power diplomacy, and so on. How one can connect this to nationalism?
Like you said, most of these points I did touch upon, but let me summarize. Um, the classic all out wars where the entire resources of a nation are pitted against those of the enemy nation or nations, a coalition of nations. They are possibly not likely anymore. And the reason for that is cost. Essentially, the cost of waging a war, the cost of continuing that war, and the cost of reconstruction post-war. Because the kind of damage, today's weapons are designed to damage 100 times more than what they did in the last major war like the Second World War. Today, one fighter aircraft can carry enough arsenal for for bringing about a certain amount of destruction than what something close to 100 aircraft did during the Second World War. You may not believe it, but the power of munitions, chemistry has now developed to a point where we have found new and better explosives that can give you bigger bang for the buck, as they say. We've been able to achieve miniaturization. We've been able to achieve. Earlier, there was a concept like blanket bombing. If you didn't know where the enemy was, all you did was you just saturated that particular area with bombs. Today, technology is so developed that an aircraft can release a weapon 20 kilometers away from the target, and that weapon will find its way and enter a building through a designated window and go and destroy a certain object that was the object of destruction. It will not only, um, you know, prevent collateral damage, but it will bring out the desired impact. Because look at the amount of fear that it will put into the enemy's mind. That I don't even see who's attacking me. He's released the weapon 20 kilometers away, or in fact, it's a very modest this thing. There are weapons that can be released 50 kilometers away and more, and from the satellites. So, it's completely mind-boggling the direction in which technology has gone. But equally, the cost of that one aircraft is more than the cost of those 100 aeroplanes that were manufactured that time. So you see, it's all comparative, but yet, since that is the case, today people are finding cheaper options to pursue the same. There's irregular war, terrorism, for instance. These are pinpricks. The investment is low, but the benefits are much greater. So, when you talk about input output ratio of a machine and then you say what is the efficiency of this machine, you can do the same with this. The irregular war, the power through improvised explosive devices, through, like I said, terrorist attacks, through these drone attacks. It's so cheap to manufacture a drone. It's so cheap to load up and to navigate it to a given point. If you wanted to do that physically, it would cost far more in terms of human lives and other costs. So that is why we are not likely to have those classic long drawn year after year kind of wars, all out wars, because today the most important national interest is economy, economic interest. And if the greatest harm is going to be caused by a war to your economy, then you would think in terms of avoidance of war or pursuing that war or prosecuting that war by other means. That is cheaper, lesser, but more effective means. I hope that satisfies the person who asked.
Yeah, yeah, sir. Thank you for answering the question. The next question is from Bhakti Panchal and Nivedita Bhave. I have clubbed these questions because these are on the same thing. Impact on India defense due to Afghanistan crisis, and is it safe for India to allow refugees from Afghanistan?
This is a very, very complex question for several reasons. Let me give you a few. One is the situation in that country is developing day to day, if not hour to hour. We are seeing those horrible pictures on our TV screens of helpless people wanting to flee Afghanistan. We are also seeing pictures of ordinary citizens celebrating Afghanistan's Independence Day by waving national flags and so on and so forth. Both are happening on the same TV screen. We know that the Taliban are saying one thing, but on the ground they are doing quite the opposite. They are saying women are allowed to work, they can do this, they can do that, but on the ground you find that nothing has changed in the last 20 years. They are still as brutal, they are still as um, cruel as they were. They're almost not forgotten the medieval methods of punishments. It's only a matter of time before the public whipping, and public execution start all over again. But having said that, like I said, there are three elements to this. One is, of course, the situation as I just explained. Second one is that the younger generation has tasted what it is like to be free, what it is like to go to a beauty parlor, what it is like to sit behind a computer and have the whole world at your feet or at your fingertips. So that is not something that's going to go away in a hurry. So resistance will take place. Third, and there are four elements actually. Third, another very important element is if you go into the history of Afghanistan, nobody, and I mean nobody, much less a foreign power, has been able to rule Afghanistan. Afghanistan is governed or ruled, if you like that term, by a combination of warlords who have their own little fiefdoms, their own spheres of influence where only their writ runs. The government at Kabul only has a certain amount of control over that and over larger things which are at the national level, like currency, foreign affairs, and so on, banking, power supply, which of course the warlord can't generate on his own. So it's a very fluid kind of a thing. Taliban has got no experience, and I repeat, no experience whatsoever of governing a country. They are a ragtag band of people who have been motivated by whatever ideology to establish Islamic law. But beyond that, what? What do they want to do? Do they know how to run a country? Do they know how to run a province? And how to put all provinces together so that they can call themselves a nation? The last point is we have very good relationship with Afghanistan. And an enemy's enemy is a friend. That's an old saying. And if Afghanistan is the enemy of Pakistan, then obviously Afghanistan would, it makes sense for us to be friends with Afghanistan. But that aside, leaving the politics aside, Afghanis have been great friends with India from centuries. Remember, there was no Pakistan, but there was Afghanistan, right? So our relations were with Afghanistan. Pakistan is an upstart by comparison. Pakistan is a nation that was born overnight. Nobody went to jail for Pakistan's liberation because there was no Pakistan. There was only India, all the way up to the Durand line. Okay, albeit under various rulers. Even the Peshwas from Pune went all the way up to Attock, which is and close to Peshawar. So there was no Pakistan. Our relationship with Afghanistan is centuries old, even before Pakistan came anywhere on the world map. That is something which we must not forget. And the Afghans do value that relationship. And it has been proved time and again. It's not just I'm saying this as a out of romanticism, but this is true. This is how they look at the Indians. So we cannot abandon them. Those Afghans, there are close to a few thousand Afghans in India in doing various things. Students, traders, diplomats. There are, there are close to about 30, 40 cadets at the Indian Military Academy training to be officers. In fact, one of the Taliban guys was trained in India to be an officer. He passed out in 1982, became an officer in the Afghan army, and then 14 years later, in 96, he quit the army and joined Taliban. Today, he's the chief spokesperson for Talibanis who keeps frequenting the Doha talks. I forget his name offhand. So those are our roots. Our relationship is a multi-pronged relationship. So we shouldn't just look upon them as refugees. What about the Sikh population in Afghanistan? There's a sizable Sikh population, and the government has already opened its doors to that population to, I can't call it repatriate because they were born there. They lived all their lives in Afghanistan. But because they are Sikhs, they're ethnically closer to us. And so are the other Afghans who've been close to us in one manner or the other. So it's an evolving situation. Right now we should wait and watch, pursue our national interests, not trade them for anything. That's my answer.
Yeah. So the officer or the Taliban leader which Sir mentioned, I would like to state his name, that is Mohammed Abbas Tanikzai.
That's right.
He was popularly known as Sheru.
That's
Was
correct.
known as Sheru in IMA.
That's
So
correct.
yeah, moving on to third
Yes.
question. It is by Chanchal Pandey. Maybe that may be a bit personal. How the army people get so much of courage?
Courage is something like a bank account. You build it over a period of time and you spend it when the time comes. How do you build it? By a long process which starts from homes of people. Ours is a volunteer army, remember. People join the army of their own volition. Nobody comes to them and say, इस गांव से मुझे 3 आदमी चाहिए. It doesn't happen that way. For 100 vacancies, there are 20,000 people lining up. Of course, many of them are there as a job. I won't deny that. But once they enter the army, they imbibe an ethos, a spirit of sacrifice, a certain way of thinking. It gets molded in a certain fashion, which makes them do what they do. They do when they're required to do what they do. Now, it's not a jugglery of words, but let me explain a little more. Do you know, in the army, we don't even bother about what caste is he, what religion is he, where does he come from? No. Once he is part of the army, his religion is the army. National service is his lifestyle. So that, and it's not that every once a week there is a lecture by the senior person who tells them this, that this is your, no, it just, they just imbibe it, they just absorb that ethos which becomes part of them for life. And that's why when it comes to a challenge, again, I'm referring back to some of the movies that you may have seen. And then at the sharp end, when you're facing certain death or a possible death, why does a man actually get up and face, because he wants to save his comrade who's injured, because he feels a sense of anger that his buddy who was sitting next to him a moment ago is no longer alive, is no longer talking, is bleeding profusely. That angers you to a point where you forget about your own safety. You only think of your comrade, the izzat of your paltan, the izzat of your flag. And that's what makes people do what they do. And when they look back, maybe they'll say, I must have been a bloody fool to do that. How the hell did I do that? But then it's not done only out of a frenzy. It is done certainly as a conscious thought, which may sound very surprising to, because it's like there's a contradiction in what I'm saying. But that's exactly how it is. Once you have that ethos, that's it. Nobody says that I will not sit next to this Jawan because he's a Dalit. We don't even think about it. I can share things from his plate. What I can, I do. And once you're part, like today, it's been more than, well, from my regiment, if you take it, it's been better part of 40 years since I left my regiment. But I'm still closely in touch with all people there. Some of those Jawans who were there were not even born when I retired. But it's like that family spirit, that spirit of being one. Anyone who visits Pune from my regiment or something or the other happens to know I'm here, he'll give me a call and say, "Sir, I'm coming for a cup of tea with you." I don't even know him from Adam. When he comes, then I ask him, "बेटा कब ज्वाइन किए थे? कितनी सर्विस हो गई? अब क्या कर रहे हो? कौन सी ड्यूटी कर रहे हो?" And it's like we've worked together for 15 years. You know, that's the beauty of interpersonal relationship, a certain way of life, a certain ethos. That's what makes the army build that courage when it's required. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you, sir, for answering that question. So,
Let me
uh,
add a postscript to it. Many times I've been asked, if you had to do it all over again in your next janam, what do you want to do? I don't even hesitate a minute or a second, in fact, before saying I'll join the army. That's the only thing I want to do. Anyway, so much for that.
thank you so much for such inspiring words, sir. And moving on, we have questions from the chat box. And yeah, so first question is from Kajal. Can you please tell the difference between nation state and nation?
Don't get into that. No, don't get into that for the simple reason that the nation state, as I mentioned very briefly, the concept of a nation state came from the Treaty of Westphalia so many centuries ago. Today, tell me, see that time a nation state, which meant that it had to fulfill certain criteria before it could be called a nation. It must have people, it must have territory, it must have defined borders, and so on and so forth. Today, tell me, haven't the borders lost their meaning up to a point? Today, do you require a visa to send money from, or some kind of a transaction, or permission from the government to send money across, or to talk to X, Y, and Z to have relationships? Borders have lost that part of the meaning because of, well, technology being one of the contributors. But as a concept, we are now really, and this is an old Indian concept, which I'm glad that the world is realizing today, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The whole world is a family. The world is now discovering it, which our ancestors and the wise people knew that time or had thought of at that time. So don't get into that the theory of nation and nation state, because much of that has changed. Now we need to redefine some of those aspects. Yes, nations would continue for the foreseeable future, but whenever you're in doubt, go to the European community or the European Union example. They are nations in their own right, but are they thinking in terms of going to war because they have a difference of opinion? I don't think there'll be war between France and Germany anymore. In fact, NATO troops are stationed in each other's countries routinely. Nobody thinks of German soldiers on French soil and vice versa. In Second World War, it was unthinkable. They were considered enemy. So it's better, unless it is required for a further research into the thing, then it requires a far more deeper study of the two terms. But for the purpose of this talk and this discussion, it's really not worth our while to go into the definitions. I did go through the definition of a nation state and revisited that, but then I realized so much has changed. Our whole um, understanding of nations and international relations and international exchanges has changed drastically. People who were enemies years back today are the friendliest. America dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And today they are the closest of allies, interdependent. America shares its closest secrets with the Japanese. In fact, they have a little core group, and Japan is very much part of that core group, although they're not part of Europe. So, see how things can change. So, what are we talking about, nation and nation state? Those are concepts which should be studied as a part of evolution. Have I confused you, convinced you, or avoided the issue? I don't know. Maybe a bit of both or all.
Yeah. Uh,
No, sir.
I think we have time for one more question, right?
yeah, sir, there are, I would like to ask, there are three more questions in the chat box, and we have already reached our time limit.
Okay.
So, how many questions do you want to take?
If you can cleverly group all three into one, we'll take that as the last.
Yeah, actually, one question is has been written in the chat box, typed out, and two of them wants to ask them specifically by unmuting.
Okay, let them unmute, ask, and let me do the combination and see what
Yeah.
justice I can do.
So, Sakshi, you can unmute.
All right. Thank you, Rohit. Good evening, sir. So in 2015
Wait
or
a minute, Sakshi. I thought you were my friend coordinating all this. Now you want to grill me? Okay, all right. Go right ahead.
okay, thank you, sir. So in 2015 or 16, this lady from Lady Shri Ram on air and talked about how, according to her, actually, war is a state-sponsored terrorism. What she said is, war didn't kill my father. Sorry, Pakistan didn't kill my father. War did. And she's a daughter of a martyr from of Kargil War. So I actually wanted to know your opinion, for as in you are someone who has served the nation for the longest time. So I would like to know your opinion on something so huge.
Uh, yeah, okay. I only heard parts of that question because in between your voice was fading, but okay. I think I generally got the gist of it. If I miss out something, either you or Rohit can, say that this is the part that I missed. What is the other question?
Yamuna Devi, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Rohit. Sir, I want to ask. Hello. Uh,
Yeah, I can hear you.
You
How
can.
India can become a superpower using a soft power, and how India can get it lost territory from Pakistan and China.
Ask Mr. Modi that question. Okay, but seriously, okay, I'll answer that. I'll answer that. Sakshi, your thing was mainly about Pakistan, right?
No, so sir, am I audible enough?
You're audible, but if you like, Rohit can relay that to me because for some reason, in between, it's sort of fading off and coming back. Maybe it's at my end, I don't know. But okay, go
Uh,
ahead. Tell me again, once again.
All right, sir. So in 2015 or 16, this lady from Lady Shri Ram College went on air and talked about how war, according to her, is a state-sponsored terrorism. What she said is, Pakistan didn't kill my father, war did, and blamed the state for it. Her father is actually a martyr of Kargil War. So, what I wanted to ask is, I wanted to know your opinion on, as someone who has served this nation, I wanted to know your opinion on this.
Um, okay, I've got the gist of what you're saying, what this question is all about. I also have understood that question about how can we get back our territories from Pakistan and so on. Let me sort of combine and not answer the entire thing because that will take probably another 15 minutes. But let me touch upon this thing and give you some pointers. Right? I think that would be the best under the circumstances. Let's take your part of the question first, Sakshi, and that is, you see, an aggrieved person, a person who has actually suffered a certain personal loss, in the family or as a person and so on and so forth, is bound to have some very bitter reaction about it, which is understandable. And for want of, let us say, the appropriate mechanism to deal with it at the right time, he or she was left to her own devices to deal with that problem. So there are sometimes feelings that what has the government done about this? And if Pakistan is doing this, then how are we taking a revenge for what I've lost? Number of such things come to a person's mind and say, at times, I've seen, I'll give an example of what happens in Kashmir Valley, where I spent a long, long time and dealt with terrorism for many years. A person who, let's say, now I'm going to give you both the examples. You take this Burhan Wani. You heard of him? Okay. Now his brother apparently died at the hands of the security forces, which was later on proved to be as a result of some crossfire. He was not targeted. He died, but nobody was sort of gunning for him. However, on Burhan Wani's young mind, it meant that the state has killed him, the army has killed him, or the security forces have killed him. That was enough motivation for that young mind to say, मैं इसका बदला लूंगा, मेरे भाई के मौत का बदला मैं लूंगा इस फौज से. And then he became a terrorist. Then, of course, he was a young fellow, handsome. He was, that time, the terrorists organizations were learning the art of, going public with on media devices and so on. So he became a great hit with the girls in Kashmir, apart from other things. So what I mean is he fired up the imagination of number of young Kashmiri people by saying that I also want to be like Burhan Wani. Now I'll give you the opposite example. The terrorists come and take away a person from a house in the middle of the night, thinking that he's a person who provides information to security forces. Whereas it's a case of mistaken identity at best. The person had nothing to do with anyone. And a brutal, a person who dies in the crossfire dies a relatively clean death, with maybe just a bullet injury or whatever. These guys torture and they make an example. I don't want to go into details because you all will be horrified if I tell you what, particularly groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Pakistani terrorist groups, not Hizbul Mujahideen. Hizbul Mujahideen is still Kashmiri boys. There are boys who have gone astray. I still maintain that. And who should one day come back to the mainstream. But these Pakistanis, they try and make an example out of a civilian who they think was helping the government or the security forces. So they brutalize him and leave his body in the main chowk of that village or town for everyone to see. At times they have hung it on a pole. They dehumanize a person to a point like this. Imagine what happens to his family. ये बिल्कुल बेकसूर था, इसने कुछ नहीं किया था, इसको क्यों उठा के ले गए? So the man said, now I'm going to join the army and teach these guys a lesson. Do you know, for every army recruitment, and when I was talking about 100 vacancies and 20,000 people coming, I was not exaggerating. They actually came. In my time there, I remember, and the same thing happens even till today. We had a recruitment rally near Anantnag. There's a big hilltop and there's flat ground on top. It's like a huge plateau. So we use that to conduct the recruitment tests and everything. 120 vacancies and close to 20,000 young people landed up there. So we had to do a process of elimination by saying people who are, we run a test, and then there's the first set of elimination from written tests, and then there's physical fitness, and so on and so forth, number of things. But that's the response. And all of them are not just looking for jobs. So there is the good side of it also. And therefore, it depends on this aggrieved person, where is he or she coming from? People who would want to take revenge even on Pakistan, leave alone just the local terrorists. That also happens. And these are things which are more individualistic rather than as a general rule, where the government is callous or unconcerned about deaths or losses of individuals. At times, even the society, doesn't do its bit. After all, when people come forward to give help, at times, people come and give you information that so and so is a terrorist, and if you believe him and take him at his face value, you could be committing a huge blunder. He's trying to sort out his personal enmity. He doesn't like somebody because that somebody is changed his sister, and he is not capable of taking because he's a gunda. The other guy is a gunda. So he comes and tells the army guys or the police guys or these CRPF or anyone, BSF, that so and so he is hobnobbing with the terrorists. Now, if you just go and put a bulletin to him straight away for being a terrorist, you'll be committing a grave, grave mistake. So before the army acts, actually, we make very certain and corroborate this before we take any action. Because like it happened in Buran Wani's case, that famous story in Ramayana you must have heard, or must have at least known that, when the great war was going on between Ravan and Ram and his the two armies, those people had some kind of a magical power where from every blood drop that fell on the ground, one more chap would rise, These fighters would come up from the blood that was dropping. Of course, it's fantasy, but this is what happens. If you kill an innocent, you will create 10 terrorists. Because everybody who was connected with him will want revenge. And they'll say, अच्छा, मैं बंदूक तो नहीं पकड़ सकता हूँ, लेकिन मैं इनकी मदद जरूर करूँगा. I'll carry their messages. I'll hack their weapons. So they are even more dangerous than the terrorists themselves. So you don't want to create more terrorists than the ones that you are eliminating. So by and large, we are doing things all right, because one more last example I'll give you of how the process is in the right direction. When I was in the valley till 2002, 2003, I would say, almost August, September, same period. Our estimate of the total terrorists operating in Kashmir Valley was 2,500. Today, there are about 300. 300. Where have all the 2,200 terrorists gone? Gone where they should have gone earlier. Either surrendered, or vanished into thin air, or killed by the security forces. Okay, arrested by the police. So obviously, the direction in which we are pursuing this is not grossly wrong or incorrect. Along the way, something will happen. Human rights violations will take place unknowingly sometimes. Long answer. Taking back territories from Pakistan. Like I told you, the cost of waging a war, and all out war, has gone up so much. I'll give you a very small example. During 1965 war, we captured a pass called the Hajipir Pass. across the line of control, that time called ceasefire line, right? So that was captured by one battalion, which actually sent in 2 companies worth, about 200 odd men. Of course, there was backup and reserves and everything. That was what it took to capture Hajipir Pass. Today, it will probably require 10 times that force. Because of the kind of defensive mechanism that have come about. There are early detection devices. You can't hide anything by way of your preparations from the enemy. There is that eye in the sky watching every move. Today, satellites can pick up the car's registration number. The camera has become that sharp. And these are not American cameras. I'm talking about Indian cameras, Indian satellites. This is our capability. So you can't really hide anything. You can only fool him. You've seen that movie where the atomic explosion was done? By how the American satellite was fooled? You should see that Parmanu, that movie. So you can fool him. It's like, you know what the technology offers you, so I will see how I can overcome the capability of that technology. But that was so many years back. Today, that trick may not work. Today, the moment there is a sense of trouble, you can reposition your satellites to cover a piece of ground almost round the clock. Well, in that movie, they'll show you that the American satellite used to do an orbit in so many hours. So once it did the orbit, you knew that it's not coming back for so many hours. So during that period, they dug that tunnel or they dug that hole where the device was to be buried, and so on and so forth. And before that satellite would come up, they would, once again level the ground and do everything as if nothing's happened. All that trick was okay that time. You can't use the same trick again and again. So to come to that point, the cost of recapturing militarily will be prohibitive. At what cost? In terms of lives, in terms of money, in terms of wherewithal. That is the first part. The second part is there a better way to do it? If you study Chanakya Niti, Arthashastra, it gives some pointers. If you can create a trouble from within that area, which is led by the people, and I have a theory about it. I call it the reverse tsunami. Ripple effect is something that we all understand. If you put a stone in placid water, the ripples would be formed and they would go. As they go further, they start dying till it becomes peaceful again, right? So what we need to do is to create that tsunami from inside Pakistan. So the waves should come out towards us. And people should come. When Bhutto was hung in 1979 in Lahore jail, I was posted in J&K at that time, and we were told that there are going to be huge processions taken, and people will come out on the streets and agitate and this, that, and the other, and they'll use that as an excuse to conduct anti-government demonstrations and so on and so forth. Demonstration did take place, even in our area, close to the border. You've seen the movie Uri or heard about it? I was posted to a place very close to Uri. And the villagers came up to us in a huge gathering. And guess what they were carrying with them? They had no weapons. Those days, AK-47s couldn't be just, supplied by somebody across the border. And today you can you go to Peshawar, like you buy your vegetables, you can buy ammunition and weapons. Literally. There are videos which will show you. Google it and you'll find that. It's true. And just like you say, a good vegetable or a fruit seller will say, खा के देखो, मीठा है. That guy will say, ये अभी अभी बन के आया है, आप फायर करके देखो कितना अच्छा फायर करता है. Literally. So that wasn't available. They came with farm implements. Somebody carrying the various things that they use on the farm. They came, they said, इसके साथ हम मामला करेंगे. और वो कहते हैं आजाद कश्मीर. And this is brings me to a famous thing about Azadi, Azadi. Nobody close to the border talks about Azadi. Azadi is only shouted in the streets of Srinagar, Anantnag, Pulwama, Baramulla. The people in Kandahar, I had gone once, close to the border, next to the relations between the army and the civilians are so close, they're very friendly. So once I asked them, I said, ये लोग इतना चिल्लाते हैं आज़ादी आज़ादी, आपका क्या कहना है? जैसे साहब, हम तो आज़ाद वैसे ही हैं. वो हमारे भाई जो पार बैठे हैं, पार मीन्स अक्रॉस द लाइन ऑफ कंट्रोल, उनको आज़ाद करना है साहब. वो तो अपने आप को ऐसे बोलते हैं आज़ाद कश्मीर. आज़ाद तो हम हैं, आज़ाद कश्मीर तो ये है. उनको आज़ाद करना है साहब. And that day, this is exactly what the villagers told me. जैसे साहब, हमको हमारे भाइयों को आज़ाद करना है. ये पाकिस्तानी फौज उनके ऊपर जुल्म कर रही है. So, idea is to create that rebellion, that tsunami within Pakistan-held territories, and get them to say we want to join India. That is a far smarter way of doing it. That's it.
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your experiences and bursting out the myth of Azadi in Kashmir Valley.
I can keep talking about Kashmir Valley till you'll all go to sleep out of boredom.
Yeah, so on this note, I would like to end today's session. Thank you so much, Patankar sir, for covering such a theoretical subject. Sir, you talked about nationalism, supranationalism, and patriotism, and interrelation between both. Thank you so much, sir, for such an insightful lecture and answering so many questions, sharing your experiences, and the one thing which I particularly liked is a balanced approach on the question whether national patriotism is a cause of war or nationalism. And so, on this note, I would like to end today's session. And from the entire Political Science Association, we are delighted to have you for this session. And thank you so much, sir. Yeah.
One last thing, particularly to Sakshi, I don't think I answered your question fully. So you have my email ID. Why don't you just email that question to me, and I'll answer it online.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being with you young guys. Like I said, you are our future. Take this country to the place it deserves. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for precious time.
My
Thank you,
pleasure.
sir.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Great pleasure being with you. Bye.
Priyanka, when I stop the recording, you will get it. I guess you will receive it on your college email ID.